Welcome back to our study of Genesis. Today we're going to begin looking at the life of Abraham. Other than Moses, I think Abraham is probably the most significant figure in all of the Old Testament. And I think all of what we've seen in Genesis 1 through 11 is really setting the stage of what is going on with humanity. And now enter Abraham as sort of this major step of how the rest of the story is going to begin, how all the things set up in Genesis 1 through 11 are going to come to a conclusion, how all of the problems set up are going to be solved. It's going to be something God is going to do through Abraham. So Abraham is very significant. Abraham is also significant not just for what he does at his stage in salvation history, but he is a model and his life is a teaching tool for us. He is used again and again in the New Testament as a model for how we are to be saved. Paul talks about him in Romans, in Galatians, he comes up in Hebrews, he comes up in Jesus' teachings as sort of a guideline of how we are to understand salvation. And so he is a very significant figure. Romans 4:16, Paul calls him the father of us all, referring to believers. It is through Abraham salvation is going to come, and God's working in Abraham's life. And Abraham becomes the first believer in the Jewish and Christian sense that Paul is talking about there in Romans. For all believers, we look to Abraham as our father of the faith. So we can't overstate his importance in the Bible, and in the book of Genesis in particular, chapter 22, when God calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, is really the peak and most important chapter in Abraham's life. As we begin to look at Abraham today, we're going to begin to build towards that chapter. It is a deeply complicated and confusing chapter. How could God ask Abraham to do something like this? And yet, it is a central chapter to the Jewish understanding of God, His salvation, and therefore the Christian faith. So first we need to look at the beginning of Abraham's story, and we'll go through chapter 21 and see how God works in Abraham's life to prepare the way for the events of chapter 22 to come about. And the first thing we read about Abraham is really a little sort of background piece at the end of chapter 11. In verse 27, we read, "This is the account of Terah's family line." And anytime you see in Genesis, this is the account of, it sort of marks a major break. Our chapter headings should probably fall with those, because that's how the writer of Genesis is introducing a new section of material. And so we read about Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, Abram is going to be Abraham's name until Genesis chapter 17. And so we'll see in a moment how Genesis 17 is a pivotal chapter in these introductory chapters in the story of Abraham. But we're introduced to this family, and Terah is the father of 3 sons, and one of these, Haran, dies in Ur of the Chaldeans, and so now there's 2 brothers, Abram and Nahor, and they both marry, we read, and these families are going to be important throughout the rest of these chapters about Genesis. So we read here where Lot comes from, how Lot is Abraham's nephew. We read here about Sarai for the first time, Abraham's wife. And we also read about this other family, Nahor, that's going to play a prominent role when Abraham is looking for a wife for his son Isaac. So this all sets the stage, and it tells us that there's a lot going on in this time period, even before the main story of Abraham begins in Genesis 12. When we first encounter Abraham, he's 75 years old. But this background helps us understand that Abraham is coming out of the same area where all these nations split off and separated from at the Tower of Babel. And he is coming from a family according to tradition, and it makes sense in the text, because everyone was steeped in paganism. So his family probably was a pagan family. There's tradition that his family worked in making idols, and Abraham had a resistance to this or questioned it, was bothered by it. And Abraham, of course, also has a wife, Sarah, who cannot have children. And that all sets the stage for Genesis chapter 12. So let's look there in Genesis 12, verse 1. It says, "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you.'" And this sets in motion everything. Abraham is said to go through 10 different tests of faith. Each test of faith is building Abraham and preparing Abraham for the next stage that God has for him. We see a beautiful inner working of God is going to use Abraham to accomplish his salvation, and yet Abraham is going to go through a growing process. Abraham has to actually take steps of faith. And God puts just exactly in Abraham's path what Abraham is ready for and what will help Abraham grow to the next step. Even as Abraham stumbles along the way, you see God's hand guiding all of this. So God calls Abraham to take this incredible step of faith. Go from your people, your country. You're going to go to this foreign land. This is a time period not like ours. Even today, it would be so difficult to try to figure out how to live in another land, what their laws are, how to have a home there, how to navigate the language barriers and all the cultural barriers and everything else. But Abraham is told to go to this land I will show you. And then here are the key verses in 2 and 3 of chapter 12 that set the whole story in motion. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So from the very beginning, Abraham is to bring about a blessing to all the nations of the earth, not just the Jewish people, but he will be the father of all. He will be the father of all who believe in Christ. He will be the person through which God creates a nation, through whom he brings the Messiah. And all these things are going to come about. Now, this is the first version of God's covenant with Abraham. He comes to Abraham, he makes this promise, "I want you to go to this nation, this land I'm going to show you, and I'm going to do all these things for you." There are going to be 2 other times that God expands on, if you will, this covenant, that he adds in more detail. And the story revolves around this covenant and then 2 more reaffirmations of this covenant or new covenants God makes with Abraham in which more detail is spelled out. But it is a promise God makes. It impacts the entire world. It is ongoing to this day. There's no expiration on it. There is something significant about the nation that comes from Abraham, the Israelites, and how it blesses all those who follow in Abraham's example. I would add that I think what we see here going on in connection with some of our discussion on spiritual warfare is that God is making his own nation. He assigned at the Tower of Babel in chapter 11 authority over all these 70 different nations to the different supernatural beings called the sons of God in Genesis 6. But here, God is forming a new nation, not one of the 70, but one that will be just for his own possession. But what God is establishing here is that through this nation, God will break down the bondages that all the other nations have to these supernatural beings. And so this is God putting into place this storyline, this work of salvation in which Christ at the cross defeats the rulers and authorities and sets up that ultimately he will completely defeat them when he returns again, and all nations will be ruled directly by God. This is tied in with the Great Commission. We are to go into all nations, baptizing and teaching to obey everything Jesus has commanded. Well, I'd like to go on from here, and as I read through Genesis 12, I want to begin to point out another tool of interpretation that we have in how do we study a book like Genesis and many Old Testament books. And that is the concept of chiasm. And I'm going to explain that. Let me introduce a story here, first of all. In Genesis 12, verse 10, we read the following. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman, and when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. All right, this is a story that we kind of cringe at. What is Abraham doing? Why would he give instructions to say, "This is my sister"? And we learn later on that this was true. Sarah was his sister, although in that language, and according to Jewish tradition, that may not mean that she's literally his sister or half-sister, but actually a niece. I'm not going to go into the details on that, but anyway, she is a close relative. So that is true. And so Abraham is afraid that if it's known that he's her husband, they're going to kill him, which did happen in that culture. So Abraham, actually, I think in this story, it represents a failure of his faith in God. He doesn't yet have a faith in God that will sustain him to trust God through a trial like what is coming in Genesis 22. This is an example of Abraham's step by step. God will work to build Abraham's faith so that Abraham will have the sufficient faith when it comes time in Genesis 22 to test him. But there are two things about this story that are interesting to me in terms of interpretation. One question that comes up a lot is, why is this story seemingly in the Bible twice? Because a few chapters later, we're going to read how Abraham does the same thing again with a different king. And it's kind of like, Abraham, didn't you learn the first time that you shouldn't do this? I do think that Abraham was not expecting that they would go ahead and marry Sarah anyway. And so Abraham probably was wondering for a time, what do I do now? How am I going to get my wife back? How is God's promise going to be fulfilled in my life now? But God stays faithful to his promise and brings about the next stage of fulfillment of his promises to Abraham, even though Abraham did something that wasn't consistent with how God would have wanted him to act here. It showed that his faith wasn't to the level that God wanted to develop in Abraham. So this story comes up twice, and what I want to do now is show you a picture just of an outline of Genesis 12 through Genesis 21. And so all of these chapters that precede the great chapter of Abraham in Genesis 22, they have a pattern to them. And you can follow this pattern. Just what we've already looked at the beginning of Genesis 12 is the introduction, where God makes this promise of how I'm going to make a great nation out of you and bless all the nations of the earth through you. And then at the conclusion of this section of Genesis, we'll have the birth of Isaac, and we'll see how God is beginning to fulfill those promises. And just after this introduction, where we are right now in Genesis 12, 10 through 20, Abram lies about Sarai in Egypt. He says, "She is my sister." It's not technically a lie, but it's the information he withholds that he's actually married to her that is the lie. And so we see that happen right after the introduction. And then right before the conclusion, over in Genesis 20 is where we see a very, very similar story of Abraham making up the same story for the same reasons, and the king seizes Sarai to be his wife, and the story seems to repeat. Well, this is because we're meant to compare these stories. We're meant to see them as forming a certain outline that's pointing us really to the center. And so the next story is Lot settling in Sodom in Genesis chapter 13, which corresponds to what we call C prime there towards the bottom. Lot flees Sodom. So that whole story about Sodom is kind of bookend there as the third part of the Abraham story, and then the third to last part of this section. So look at letter D. Abram intercedes for Lot and Sodom militarily. That's where that part of the story comes. He goes, gets men together and chases this army that has took Lot and Sodom captive. But in D prime, later on, right in the corresponding part of the outline, it is Abraham intercedes for Sodom and Lot in prayer. This is when God appears to Abraham and tells him what's going to happen to Sodom, and Abraham says, "Will you destroy the city if you were to find 50 righteous there?" And so Abraham is in battle, in prayer, interceding for Sodom that way versus militarily earlier in the story. So all the stories we're going to look at through chapter 16 have a corresponding sort of reflective matching piece later in the story. There is the promise of a son for Abram himself in chapter 15, which corresponds to a promise of a son not only from Abraham himself, not only a physical descendant of Abraham, but from Sarah herself. And then we have Ishmael, his birth and promise, and another story about Ishmael surrounding that center chapter, chapter 17, which tells us this is the key chapter about Abraham and the covenant God is going to make with him. So as I go through these chapters, I'll reference this, that we're meant to pair these stories together to see how they explain each other, how they point us to the central significance of what's going on. So the covenant in chapter 17 is going to be very important for us to pay attention to. I also think that there's another aspect of what's going on that we need to pay attention to as we interpret. And that is that there are patterns. We see certain stories repeat, not only to fulfill the chiasm or the outline or structure, but they often point to stories that come even much later in the Bible. And that means that these stories have a prophetic element. Think about what we just read in Genesis chapter 12. Verse 10 says, "Now there was a famine in the land." What does that remind us of? Well, later on in Genesis, there's going to be a famine in the land that sends Joseph's brothers down to Egypt to buy food. Right? Because of that 7-year famine that's going to be a big part of the Joseph story, the Israelites go down to Egypt. So here we also have Abraham goes down to Egypt, it says in verse 10, to live there for a while, just like all the Israelites at the end of Genesis are going to go down to Egypt to live there for a while. And then Abraham has this whole story about Sarah, and he's worried about the Egyptians killing him, and then Sarah is taken into captivity, in a sense. She is made to be the wife of Pharaoh, and she's held prisoner, so to speak, in Pharaoh's house. Well, all the Israelites, when they come down to live in Egypt for a while, they're going to, in a sense, be deceived because another Pharaoh comes up that's going to enslave them and prevent them from leaving and trap them in his house, so to speak, in the nation of Egypt. And then we have several verses that remind us of things that happen in the Exodus story. The Israelites all recognize how beautiful Sarah is. The Egyptians later will recognize how prosperous the Israelites are, and there will be that kind of praise for them. And then after the Israelites are brought into, or after Sarah is brought into Pharaoh's house, corresponding to the Israelites brought into slavery, it says in verse 17 of Genesis 12, just like what happens in the Exodus, but the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So this is a sort of mini version of the 10 plagues that we read about in Exodus. And then what happens? Pharaoh summons Abram. He says, what have you done to me? Why did you say she's your wife? And then he says, take her and go. take her and go. Now, of course, what is the Pharaoh in Exodus famous for? He's asked to let the people go, and he says, I will not let you go. So there's the contrast. Whereas this Pharaoh acts reasonably, responds to the plagues the way that someone would who recognizes that God is powerful and that he is committing injustice. This future Pharaoh fails to do that. This future Pharaoh instead hardens his heart. So we have a contrast here set up between these two pharaohs. But all of this is predictive. It's foreshadowing. It's saying something like this is going to come up again later. And we're meant to compare these stories. And we'll see a lot of examples of that happening throughout the chapters of Genesis. So this gets us started into the Abraham story. Of course, the question that is presented to us in this opening chapter is, how is God going to bring about, through this man Abraham and his barren wife Sarah, who don't really know how to live in this foreign land, who are suffering under famine, who are vulnerable, and at any moment someone like a Pharaoh can present a life-threatening force to them. How is it that God is going to protect them and navigate them to a place where this prophecy of blessing is fulfilled? And we begin to see God do just that, even here in chapter 12, through the sending of plagues on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. We'll continue here next time in chapter 13.